close the door. No, it's okay. But if you cross, go back. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Kindly resume your seats. Thank you. Let me proceed on established protocol and not acknowledge all the distinguished people here. I just refer to our chairman, Twitwi Opoku, and the author of the book, Mr. Kwesi Pratt, and all the distinguished people here who have come to lend your presence to what is the launch of a very important book. Kwesi said a few things, and he said that the issue of reparations is not just about, it's about recognizing the grievous harm that was done. To tell him was that his fufu had fallen into my soup. Because from 2023, I got an invitation to Nova Scotia. Why I was invited, I didn't really understand. But it was a conference of African universities studying reparations. And so in 2023, that's where my interest in the issue of reparations was ignited. And so he didn't know I was stepping on the stone when he came and said, "Can you write the foreword for my book on reparations?" Of course, I was gradually becoming a scholar myself on the issue of reparations, so I gladly accepted. And I had come back from that conference with loads and loads and loads of studies on reparations. So it made it very easy for me to pre-launch the book. We ordered some copies, and I very happily distributed it amongst my fellow presidents. What I have to admit to him is that because I couldn't find him in office absence when I distributed the book, they asked for an autograph, but the author wasn't there, and so they say, "I autograph on your behalf." So if you find a few copies of your book with my autograph on it, then I am seeking your permission to attend that. He referred to Sarah Batman, and he talked about a woman with significant backsides. I'm sure we all have sisters and wives. I can particularly testify. And because of the Caucasian physique was for flat bottoms. And so this was seen as extraordinary that a woman should be so endowed at the posterior. And so, like you said, she was taken to Europe. She was South African, and she was taken to Europe by two people who promised her a good life and a lot of money if she would play along. And so they exhibited her in a cage, like an animal. And people would come and look at her. She would have to undress to show her posterior. And people would come and look at her and laugh and jeer and do everything. Eventually, that woman committed suicide. I mean, the humiliation, the degradation was too much to bear. He also gave the example of the woman from Albina, Monica Fernandez, they called her. In those days when they baptized you, they discarded your native name. So we don't have on the record what the actual native name was, but she was baptized in the castle, and once you were baptized in the castle, you were supposed to live a pure Christian life. She was bitten by a cat, and the injury was festering. And so, I mean, like all Africans would do, she went to a herbalist to see if she could get a cure for the cat bite. And somebody went and reported her that she had gone to a fetish priest. And so they accused her of witchcraft. And they had a court in the castle. So the trial started in Elmina Castle. And the appellate body was in Portugal. And so at a point, the judiciary in the Elmina Castle decided to refer the case to the appellate body in Portugal. And so she was transported to Portugal to continue her trial. And so she was found guilty of witchcraft, but she was given a light sentence. And the sentence was Christian re-education. And so she had to undergo Christian re-education to cement her faith. And eventually she was discharged as being a reformed prisoner because she had imbibed the Christian ideology properly. But she wasn't brought back to Elmina. She was abandoned in Portugal until she died. So these are just individual examples, but they are living examples of the humiliation the African person faced in the period of the slave trade. Cabral has done a review of the book, and Kwesi also spoke, and all of them mentioned the Middle Passage. The slaves, when you go to the castle, we go there as a tourist experience to educate ourselves, but also to enjoy a day out. But we cannot imagine the unspeakable horror that our people had to go through those castles. And you see the door of no return. They show you this is the door of no return. And once you went through that arc, you were loaded onto a canoe. The ships were offshore, and they took you onto the ship. And for those of you who have studied history and the slave trade, you will see designs of how the slaves were packed. There were several floors, and so they could take you to any of the floors. They tied the men separately, the women separately, the younger teenagers, infants separately. And the shackles were on the floor, and so you had to lie down, and your hands were shackled, your legs were shackled, and so you could virtually not move. The passage from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas typically took between 80 to 90 days. So imagine being shackled in a ship for 80 to 90 days, unable to move, unable to sit, just lying on your backside. They come with a little food, open your mouth and slap something into your mouth. You are forced to swallow in order that you can survive. And in many cases, illness broke out on the ships. And when people were too ill to continue the passage, in order not to spread whatever illness they were suffering from, they were thrown overboard in what was called the Middle Passage. Now, if you look at estimates of the trade, Kwesi stated about 12 million. But if you do the math, the average slave ships took between 400 and 600 slaves at a time. And it is estimated between 1514 and 1866. So if you look at 36,000 slave voyages with an average of 400 to 600, the estimate will be much higher than 12 million. And if you landed your slave vessel with 20 to 30% loss, that was acceptable. And so, 36,000 slave voyages with almost close to 20 million people were carried across, and there was a acceptable loss of 20 to 30%. Then you are looking at deaths of between 3 and 4 million people who didn't get to the destination. And the horror of the slave trade was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. Families had lost their parents, both mothers and fathers. And so a lot of children were orphaned because their fathers and mothers were enslaved and forcibly removed. And so on the other side, relatives who were torn from their families forever and had to be auctioned, and there was a slave market. They tied you to a stake, and the white plantation owners would come and inspect, open your mouth, look at your teeth to see if any of your teeth are falling out, raise your armpits and all that. I mean, just like you buy a sheep in the market, and eventually if he decided to buy you, he took you, and like they always do, in order to enslave you completely, they change your name. And so that's how you can become Cassius Clay, because your slave owner was called Clay, and he named you Cassius. And yet your African name might have been something completely different. For those of you who have watched Roots, you remember Kunta Kinte, when they tried to force him to change his name. So these are a few more details of the slave trade and the issue of reparations. And I think that Kwesi's book is a very important contribution to the struggle for reparations, not only, like he said, in terms of monetary compensation, but also in terms of making people remember that history. There is something in history we call revisionism. Revisionism is when a government adopts a particular policy to try to rewrite the history according to how they want people to remember it. And I'm sorry to say, we saw a bit of revisionism in Ghana, where the issue of the founder of Ghana and the role of different political movements, and a new curriculum was written, and somebody's name was removed and left, reduced to one sentence and things like that. That is also revisionism. But even in terms of the slave trade, there's revisionism going on in this country. And not in this country, in this world. I don't know how many of you have visited the Smithsonian in America. I have. And it is such a beautiful documentation of American history. It starts from and they're beautiful exhibits. And then it moves from that period to when the migrants started coming from Ireland and other places, the Pilgrim Fathers and all of them, and settled on the West Coast. It also captures the early building of the railways. It captures the slave trade in detail and has exhibits on the slave trade. It captures how there was a push from the west to the east coast and how the Indians were dispossessed of their land. But it also has a lot of modern exhibits. The Apollo moon landing, the exhibits are there. The first computer that was built, you would learn about it. And so there's a lot to learn. And if you have been following the news, recently somebody said, the Smithsonian has too many negative stories. That is revisionism. And so if you go to the Smithsonian, you come out depressed. But that is your history. That is the truth. But of course, that is a way of attacking the Smithsonian and saying that, okay, take some of those adverts that are negative of America so that we can go through and see a happy story and we lived happily ever after America, you know, and that is the intent of, you know, going at the Smithsonian. And it's not only the Smithsonian, you know, Black African Month and all that are all under attack by a new group who say they are tired of being politically correct. And so they must be left free to express their racist views. And so all these are happening. And so the reparations movement is being resisted. And like Kwesi said, we all saw the genocide. It was horrible. And I've watched documentaries on Auschwitz and how people were led like cattle into the gas chambers. And they were giving a different story that they were going, you know, to be employed and paid and, you know, to have a nice place to stay as prisoners. And yet the people running the camp knew that you were packing them into a place to gas them and kill them. Women, children, men. That was horrible. But like it was said, it's documented that 6 million people were affected. The slave trade was almost twice that.